The defeat of Qiyu was already several lifetimes past. After that war, the scattered tribes had become one people, the Huaxia. They had learned to cut the floodwater into channels, and for the first time, the rivers kept to their beds. But the rivers did not keep to them forever. After the Yellow Emperor, his children's children held the world and passed it down, one worthy hand to the next. In those years, the old records say, someone mended a sky that had cracked open. Someone tasted every plant on the mountains and learned which would feed a man and which would kill him. Someone read the markings on a river beast's back and drew from them the first signs of writing. The throne went from one good ruler to the next, until it came to a king named Yao. And in his time, the water came back. It did not come as rain. It came as a rising. The rivers swelled past their banks and did not stop. The lakes reached out and took the fields between them, until you could not say where a shore had ever been. It came worst at night. A village would lie down whole, and somewhere in the dark a riverbank would let go. A long, low sound, like the earth drawing in a breath. And by morning the village was not there. Only water, turning slowly, carrying off a roof, a tree torn up by its roots, the body of an ox. From the high ground, in the dark, you could not see it happen. You only heard it, the bank giving way, the long rush after it. And then you waited for the light to see what was still there. The great rivers left their old roads and cut new ones wherever they pleased. The people climbed onto the hilltops, into the trees, and crowded onto the high ground with the animals that had nowhere left to run. And there they stayed. And the water did not go down. A year, then another. Children were born on those hilltops who learned to walk before they ever set foot on dry earth. To a child born up there, this was simply the world. Water to every edge of it, a strip of crowded ground, and a grey sky sitting on both. The old began to speak of the water the way they spoke of a god, one that had sat down on the world and meant to stay. Far away, across deserts and seas, other ancient peoples remembered a flood like this one. In their story, a god sent the water to drown a wicked world, and the few who lived were carried away from it, afloat in a great wooden boat. They would call it Noah's Ark. But in the east, there was no ark. No one here was carried away. They stayed where they were and set out to drive the water back. The King Yao chose a man to fight it. His name was Gun. Gun's answer was to block it. However high the water rose, he raised his walls to meet it. Wherever it broke through, he piled the bank higher. The old books say he stole a living soil from heaven, an earth that grew of its own accord, and scattered it to raise dikes that climbed on their own, to pen the whole flood in. For 9 years it held. Behind Gun's walls, a man could stand on dry ground and watch the water climbing the far side, higher than his head, higher than the rooftops, held off the land by a wall of earth and nothing else. In the 9th year, the wall let go. It went in the night, the way the rivers always went. 9 years of held-back water came down at once, and it did not flood the land below. It erased it. What the walls had kept dry, they drowned in an afternoon. Hills that had stood above the water since the beginning went under and did not come back. Gun had failed, and the water stood higher now than it ever had. By then Yao had grown old. He had a son, but he did not give the world to his son. He searched a long time for a man who could carry this land, and he found one, a man named Shun, who had come up from nothing. Shun's own family had tried more than once to be rid of him, and still he kept no hatred in him. Yao gave him his 2 daughters and watched how he kept a house. He gave him the work of governing and watched how he handled men. He sent him alone into the storms of the deep mountains to see whether he would lose his way. Shun came back every time. So Yao gave him the world, not to his son, but to the man most fit to hold it. Later ages would call this the Abdication. The throne passed not by blood, but to the worthiest hand. One of the first things Shun did was to judge Gun, whose 9 years of walls had left the land worse than he found it. Gun was sent to Feather Mountain, and there he died. But the water was still there. Shun needed another man to take up the flood. The one he chose was Gun's own son, a man named Yu. What Yu inherited was his father's unfinished work and his father's broken name. He did not rush to build. First, he went to look at the water. He stood at the edge of it. It was not raging. It was simply there, wide and brown and patient, moving so slowly it seemed not to move at all, and running on past anything he could see. For a long time, that was all he did. He walked the mountains and walked the rivers, much of it alone, following the water up to where it came from, and down to where it was trying to go. He saw where the high ground ran, and where it broke. He found the low seams in the land that the water already wanted to follow. He read the country the way his ancestor had once read the sky. And he understood the thing his father never had. You cannot wall up water, hold it back, and it only climbs. The higher you build, the worse the day it breaks. Water wants to go down, so you do not fight it. You give it a road, and you let it go where it was always going, down and down to the sea. So Yu stopped building walls and began to dig. It was the work of a generation. They broke the mountains with fire and water, burning the rock until it cracked, then splitting it along the cracks, and carried the broken earth away on their backs, basket by basket. Men stood waist-deep in cold mud from first light, their hands split open by the cord and the stone, and at night they lay down in it and rose into it again. They opened the rivers that had silted shut. They cut new mouths for old water. And where a mountain stood across the only road a river could take, they cut the mountain in 2. The old books say it was Yu who split the dragon gate, so the yellow river could pass straight through the stone. Where the river came roaring through the gap he had cut, it ran so fast and so loud that, the books say, the fish that could leap it became dragons, and the ones that could not turned back. And the books say he did not work alone. They say the same winged dragon that once fought beside the Yellow Emperor, Yinglong, dragged its tail across the land, scoring the channels, and the water ran off down the lines it left behind. They say a god of the river put into his hands a chart of all the mountains and the waters. The books set it down just so, and never say whether it was true. Yu was at the water for 13 years. In all that time, he came home 3 times. He never once went in. The first time, the road ran past his own door. His wife was inside. They had not been married long. He slowed. He stood in the road a moment, looking at the door. Then he went on. The second time, years later, he heard a sound from inside as he passed. A child crying. A son, born while he was away, that he had never seen. His hand was already on the gate. He did not push it open. He stood there while the crying went on. And behind him, out past the fields, the men were waiting at the cut, and the water was still out there, doing what it did. Then he took his hand from the gate and went back to the river. The third time, the boy was old enough to stand in the doorway and watch the man pass on the road. The boy did not call out. For a moment, across the open ground, the two of them only looked at each other. Then the man raised his hand once and went on. By the end of the 13 years, his hands and feet were worn to callus, and the hair had rubbed away from his shins. He had eaten what the labourers ate, and slept where they slept, and the work had not stopped, not for winter, not for flood. And slowly, so slowly that no one could name the day it began, the water started to go down. It did not leave all at once. It left the way it had come, a little at a time, only backward. First the hilltops widened. Then the high fields rose up out of the water, black with mud and stinking of it. And then they dried. And then they were only fields again. Roads came back where the water thinned, until one village could see the smoke of the next. The people came down off the high ground. They pressed seed into the wet earth, not sure it would take, and it took. Down at the bank, a woman knelt and beat a length of cloth clean in a river that stayed where it was meant to. In the evening, smoke rose from the cooking fires and stood straight up, the way it only does over ground that has stopped moving. A girl ran across open ground for the first time in her life and did not understand why the old people had stopped to watch her do it. The rivers went back into their beds and stayed there, not by accident this time, and not by mercy. They stayed because a man had spent his life showing them the way. Elsewhere, the flood had pushed people off their land and carried them away to begin again somewhere else. Here, no one had left. They had stayed on the ground they were born on, taken the water by the hand, and led it back to the sea. And then they drew the map of their world again, by hand, up out of the mud. Shun too grew old. He too had a son, and he too did not give the world to his son. He gave it to you, because no one was more fit to hold it than the man who had given the rivers back their roads. You had divided the drained land into 9 regions, the 9 provinces. He gathered their bronze and cast 9 great cauldrons, and on them he set the mountains and the rivers and the spirits of every region. They were not for cooking and not for war. They were the whole of the land made into one thing a man could stand before, fixed and named and held in a single place, under a single hand. From then on, whoever held the 9 cauldrons held the world. Then you grew old. by the rule that had come down to him, he had already chosen a worthy man, Yi, to hand the world to. But when Yu died, the people did not go to Yi. They went to Yu's son, Qi. He is Yu's son, they said, and Qi took the seat. For the first time, the world passed straight from a father to his son. The age when the throne went to the worthiest man was over. From that generation on, the world belonged to one family, and China's first dynasty, the Xia, had begun. This was about 4,000 years ago. By then, the pyramids of Egypt had stood in the desert for centuries, and in the land between two rivers, men were pressing their oldest stories into wet clay. And in the east, on ground that had been under water, within living memory, a dynasty laid its first stone. They remembered Yu for a long time after, not for a wall he built, because he built none, but for the rivers, which still ran where he had set them. And they remembered this, too, that before Yu, the world had gone to the worthiest man, and after Yu, it went to the sun. When the water finally drew back, it left behind the 9 provinces, and a people standing on them, and a great river running east, the way Yu had shown it. Toward the sea, it had been trying to reach all along. That was where the myths ended, and the dynasties began.